Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm sitting with Coach Jeff Hoehn. Not exactly in the same room, but in similar room on different continents. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to chatting with you. We didn't talk about this off air, but where are you located?
I'm in the UK, specifically Liverpool.
Gotcha. Awesome. Cool. I've never been, but yeah, would love to get out there at some point.
Where are you? I only know that you're in the central time zone.
So St. Louis, Missouri. So I'm like smack in the middle of the United States, like right in the middle. It's like probably 2-3 hours to go from flight standpoint to go to either coast. So right in the middle.
That's like a blessing and a curse, isn't it?
Yeah. No one ever, I always tell people the only people that come here to St. Louis are either if you have family or you come through a business trip or something like that. But yeah, being in the middle, it's nice. I feel safe here in the middle, and then it's less populated. Cost of living is a little bit lower here. We get all 4 seasons as well too here. And like the Midwest, I enjoy it. And if I ever want to get to certain weather, you can go to the West Coast, you can go south to like Florida and stuff like that. Yeah.
That's really interesting. You're selling it well too. I've never been to that area, but now you're making me think.
I wouldn't, like I said, not a great place to vacation or anything, or if you're traveling from out of the country, not much to see here, but yeah, to live, it's not too bad.
Fair enough. All right. Today, I am very excited to have you on because as I was telling you off air and for the listeners, this is going to be a bit of a coach corner because Jeff and I are both coaches. And today I really wanted to discuss with him a muscle gain primer phase because over a year ago now, I recorded a fat loss primer phase episode with Brandon Da Cruz. Dear listeners, if you want to hear about that, there are 2 episodes, not just one, all about that topic. But today we're delving into a muscle gain primer phase. However, before we start, this is the question I ask all of my guests, Jeff. Who are you? What do you do? And why are you so awesome at it?
No, I love that. A little background. Yeah. What I do. So I'm a coach, right? Like you said, we probably have the same type of audience there from that standpoint. So work with people online. I'm a big fan of body composition, building muscle, right? So those are the main focuses, but I like to take a health first approach with it, right? I think that's super important to make sure your health is in line and that's in a good spot, which I'm sure we'll touch base on today. But a little bit about my background, how I got here. Always been into working out. I started out just doing curls and push-ups and stuff. I had my dad's weight. So did that for a while and then just fell in love with it. And then I wanted to continue to learn more. So I pursued my master's, multiple certifications, and then ended up working with people in person to start probably in 2015, 2016. And then transitioned fully over to like online capacity from that standpoint. And I've been fully online since 2021 and started working online in 2017, 7 years, been coaching overall a little bit longer than that. And yeah, I'm a student of it. I love learning. I love listening to podcasts, love learning more from research review standpoint, math, things like that. Plus I have my own podcast as well. And so I have guests on from that standpoint. I love to learn from them as well too. So that's how I got into it. And yeah, just a little background from that standpoint.
Jeff, you're quite humble. I listen to your podcast very often and it's really good. So tell the audience what the title is so that they can find it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's always nice to hear. I don't know how it is for you, but you're always, who actually listens to this podcast? So it's always nice to hear that. So the title of it is the mind-muscle connection. So I actually had a mentor at the time and he just was like, hey, what do you think of this? Because I wanted to, basically my thought around it is people hear mind-muscle connection and they think, oh, the mind-muscle connection, right? From a training standpoint. And yeah, maybe we can take it from that standpoint, but I want it to be like, hey, I'm a huge proponent of adding muscle. I think it's awesome. I think it's super beneficial. And then the mind-muscle connection to tie it into like the brain and learning more. So that's how we settled on that one. And he actually was the one that suggested that name. And I was like, dude, that's it. We got to go with that one. And so that is the title of it. And I put out about 3 episodes a week, 1 guest per week, and then 2 kind of solo episodes where I just go over questions from Instagram and then questions or just a topic that I find super interesting.
Yes, the title is very clever and the content is really good. Dear listeners, it's the Mind Muscle Connection podcast and you're going to have the link in the show notes. Now, thank you for your background, Jeff. That was really insightful. To start on the topic of our conversation today, I like to begin with definitions to get everybody on the same page. So before we even get to what a muscle gain primer phase entails, can you please define what a muscle gaining phase is in your opinion?
No, absolutely. So I think there's probably, your listeners have probably heard it called multiple names, a bulking phase, a mass gaining phase, a building phase. So there's a lot of different names around it, right? And I think I personally like to call it a building phase because I feel like a lot of times when people hear massing or bulking, they think that this is going to accompany a lot of fat gain in the process, right? And I think it steers a lot of people away from a muscle gaining phase until I like to call it a building phase, right? Because we're building our body up, whether that be from again, adding muscle or again, maybe we're making sure that you're getting enough nutrients, the right macros. Our goal during this phase is to build your body up, right? Versus you take a fat loss phase, you're breaking your body down. And we know that's likely not going to be the best for long-term body composition change and whatnot there. So I like to call it building phase. And it's kind of my main goals of a building phase, muscle gaining phase would be get out of a deficit. Okay. So just making sure that no matter what we do, our main goal is going to be, hey, we want to make sure we take time out of being in a calorie deficit, just because we know that can come with certain adaptations that kind of slow your body down. So again, like you could see things like thyroid slow down, your sex hormones could start to get out of whack, hunger goes up, energy levels go down. And so we want to make sure we get out of that state for a period of time. So that's one of my main goals in a building phase, is to make sure we take some time out of that deficit. There with that. From there, obviously building muscle is a huge part of the muscle gaining phase, right? That's what we call it, the building phase. So we want to make sure that we're also setting ourselves up to build muscle. And again, that's going to happen by being out of a deficit, at least being at maintenance, potentially a calorie surplus, which I know throughout this call, we'll probably talk about. Do you need to be in a surplus or not? But again, obviously the next goal there is to build muscle. And then on top of that, the third one's going to be during this process, we also want to minimize fat gain during that. I'm sure you've had a lot of listeners as well. Maybe you even did this yourself, where there was a period of time where you thought that, oh, hey, cool, I need to build muscle. I need to get big to do that. And so I'm just going to force feed myself. And you just get in this massive calorie surplus and you think you just need to eat anything and everything. It's called like the seafood diet, right? You eat it. And that's what people will call that. And we learn more, you don't necessarily need to be in this massive surplus. And as we'll talk about, you don't necessarily need to be in a surplus to build muscle either. The bigger the surplus, the more weight you gain, the quicker you gain it, the more you're going to accumulate fat in that process for not a lot of extra muscle, if really not any extra muscle in that process. I always go back to one of my I was always a kind of a small, skinny guy, and I wanted to build muscle. And there was a football player that I looked up to, and he was super jacked. And I was like, man, I want to be like him. I'm 5'6", 5'7", and this guy's like 6 foot. And I wanted to get as big as he was. And I'm like, oh, he's 230 pounds. So I'm like, oh, I need to get up to that. But it's okay. How feasible is that for a guy that's 5'6", 5'7"? So I was like, I'm just going to push the weight gain as much as I can and just force feed not necessarily force feed, but really just make sure I'm trying to see my weight go up. And I did get my weight up. I went probably from 140, 150 to as high as about 190. Mm-hmm. I did build some muscle, but in that process, I definitely put on way more fat in that process. And looking back, it was good to gain that weight. But like I said, I probably put on more fat mass than I needed to. And that came with not as great of a look. The more body fat you have, it hides that muscle you have. So you just feel like you didn't really gain any muscle. And then obviously, if you want to try to get back to normal body fat levels, you need to cut weight, and that can come with some potential muscle loss if you have to lose a lot of body fat in that process, potentially. And so we want to just be careful. So again, in this process, we want to make sure that we minimize fat gain on the way up. So again, not force feeding, because like I said, I've seen a lot of people make that mistake of, oh, hey, this person's 230 pounds. I'm 200. I need to get up to 230 pounds, and I just need to eat my way up there. And we want to be careful with that, because that is going to come with extra fat gain. And then you obviously have to lose that body fat later if you want to have a good physique. So those are like kind of my 3 main goals of the building phase. And then also looking at your biofeedback, your training and sleep. When I say biofeedback, looking at your energy levels, looking at like your gut health, looking at things like sleep, making sure training's in a good spot, and just making sure that you're also feeling good in that process and making sure that's improving, right? Because some of those things can go downhill in a fat loss phase, like I talked about. Kind of threw a lot at you there, but those are the main goals and the overview of a building phase. I don't know if you have any follow-ups to that.
So what I hear you say is that your main goals are to get out of a deficit, especially when it's likely been going on for a while and a substantial amount of body fat has been lost, and we're starting to get the side effects of prolonged dieting, prolonged caloric restriction. It's to add more muscle tissue, and it is to minimize body fat gain as well. And so leading from there, you mentioned quite a few times that you don't think that a large surplus is necessary for muscle growth, where keyword is large. But what difference does a surplus make compared to maintenance? So when you say that a large surplus is unnecessary, is a smaller surplus beneficial in your view? And if so, why? Compared to being at calorie balance or maintenance?
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. I do think so. Based on what I've learned from other people, seen in the research, and kind of what some of the papers on this topic say, I do think that being in a surplus, a small surplus, right? And so what is a small surplus? I don't like to just give numbers of, hey, 250 calories. I like to go based off of somebody's body weight and where that's trending, right? So you're looking at about 0.25% to 0.5% of body weight per week, or maybe zooming out and looking at more of a month time span, maybe 1% to 2% of body weight per week, right? That's that surplus there. And these are based off, again, research papers. And then Eric Helms recently had a new paper on weight gain. And they did find that as the surplus got higher and higher, again, they're gaining more than 1% to 2% of body weight per month. That's where you start to see more fat gain versus muscle gain at that point, right? So there's that point of diminishing returns there. But again, if we were to look at maintenance versus a small calorie surplus, again, in that point, that 1% to 2% gain per month is likely going to be better than being at calorie balance for building muscle. However, just because it's better doesn't necessarily mean you aren't building muscle at calorie balance, right? I think a lot of people get that confused and think, oh, okay, I have to be in a calorie surplus. And that's not necessarily the case. It's just, it could probably be a little bit, you will likely see a little bit more muscle growth over time in that calorie surplus. And so in saying that, I think your kind of next question on that was, why is that beneficial versus being at like calorie maintenance?
Yeah.
Calorie balance there. And I would say the big thing would just be the extra energy that your body is getting at that point, right? Muscle falls low on the priority list in terms of once you have your day-to-day, once your body's okay, hey, we don't like our day-to-day things that we do are covered, what your body puts muscle lower on the priority list, right? In terms of adding new tissue. It doesn't necessarily see muscle as something that the more you have, the better, right? Because you have to think about this from an evolutionary standpoint. More muscle you have, that's more kind of energy that goes towards that energy costly process to build and maintain muscle. And so we're probably better off using this energy towards more basic bodily functions, right? Versus adding more muscle past what it deems useful. And so that's kind of where so then if you can bring in extra energy, it feels a little bit more comfortable to add tissue now at that point because you have that extra energy at that point there with that. And that would be the big reason why a surplus would be a little bit better. However, somebody did ask me this on Instagram a couple weeks ago. Is it the fact that you have more energy available to add more tissue, or is it that you have more energy for training? And I would say it's probably the first part, right? Again, just having more energy available for tissue. That's just that optimal kind of energy balance that your body likes to be in to build more muscle. I do think the extra energy can probably help from a training perspective, but I think that's less of why a small calorie surplus is better than just, hey, it puts your body in that optimal position. Dr. Eric Helms, who I had on my podcast recently, talked about building muscles, a farmer, right? Trying to grow his crops, right? They're trying to grow their crops. And so you want to get the right sunlight, you want to get the right fertilizer, you want to make sure it's in the right position, right? So you're like making sure that all these things are in check there. And I thought that was a really cool analogy from that standpoint.
I agree. And it's interesting you mentioned Dr. Helms and his most recent paper on weight gain, because I actually interviewed him about it in episode 61 as well. So for the listeners, you want to hear about that? Go back to episode 61. That was the first thought I had based on what you said. The second thought I had was that what I understand you're saying is that a moderate calorie surplus, and you mentioned gaining at a pace of about 1% to 2% of original body weight per month, which is pretty much the rate of body weight gain that I also look at. That is beneficial in that if your top priority is to build muscle at the fastest rate possible, then a calorie surplus will enable that. Essentially, the difference between maintenance and a moderate surplus is that a moderate surplus is going to encourage muscle gain at a faster rate. So if that is your priority, that's why a surplus is beneficial.
Can I add one more thing to that too, as you were saying that? So yes, that, and then this is something too, where when you're trying to build muscle, and this goes back to my first point here, again, one of our goals is to get out of a deficit, right?
Yes.
However, the body works on like longer time scales, shorter time scales. And obviously, if you're seeing your weight maintain, you're seeing it slowly trend up, you are in at energy balance, or you are in a surplus like over time, right? However, on the short term, one issue you could run into being at maintenance, maybe a little bit lower, is that you do potentially spend a little bit more time in the short term in a deficit. Right now, again, we have to think on a longer time scale here. Again, what happens over weeks, months at a time is more important than day to day. However, if you zoom in, it's probably up and down, right? You're probably sometimes in bit of a deficit. You're probably in a little bit more of a surplus. But again, over time, you're at maintenance or a small surplus. But even within that, I think one downside of potentially not being in a surplus is that is a little bit more time in a deficit overall, if that kind of makes sense what I'm there with that. So that would be another big thing with that.
I think I understand what you're saying, in that you're saying if you really zoom out and you're thinking, okay, I spent 3 months in a deficit. If I spend another 3 months at maintenance, let's say that the average calories across the 6 months is 1,800. So 1,500 in a deficit and 2,000 at maintenance. Whereas if you went from a deficit for 3 months, 1,500 calories to a surplus of 2,200 calories, instead of an average of over the 6 months being around 2,000 calories, 1,800 calories, now the average would be 2,000. So the average calories over time would be higher. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, so that is true. What I was saying is, let's say you are closer to your quote unquote maintenance calories versus somebody who's in a small surplus for 3 to 6 months. The person that's closer to their maintenance calories, I would say they're likely to spend in the short term in these, from a day-to-day standpoint, they have a higher chance of spending a little bit more time in a deficit in the short term versus somebody who is in that small calorie surplus over time. That person's less likely to spend in the short term more time in a deficit in the short term. Does that kind of make sense? So we're taking somebody who's at maintenance versus somebody who's in a small calorie surplus. That person who's at maintenance, just because they're eating less calories overall, they're just at a little bit of a higher chance of, in the short term, spending more time in a deficit.
Yeah, I was zooming out a lot and you were zooming in a lot. And where you were coming from. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
So this is the difference between being at maintenance versus being in a small surplus. Now, I should have said at the beginning, when we talk about a muscle gain primer phase, I'm specifically referring to a muscle gaining phase in which you decide to go into a surplus. So that's why I called it primer. We are priming somebody to be able to make the most of a surplus. And this idea for a title and the topic came from a post that you, Jeff, recently made, where you talked about things that somebody can work on before they need to worry about getting into a calorie surplus. So I want to talk about the things to work on as well. Yep. First off, I wanted to ask you, so then in your view, who is the best candidate to go into a surplus right away? Who doesn't have any things to work on before they can make the most of a surplus?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Real quick, I'm glad you brought up this post because I think, it was just a thought I had where a lot of people think they have to be in a surplus to build muscle. And as we talked about, you don't necessarily have to. And we know too that even depending on, and this may go into who fits best for this, but even some people have a decent chance of, depending on their training history, and again, we'll talk about what that looks like, to potentially even build a little bit of muscle in a calorie deficit, depending on what they're doing. So we know for sure that you don't have to build, or you don't have to be in a calorie surplus to build muscle. It can happen outside of that. And we talked about what puts you in the best position to do it, but we know you can do it outside of that. And, what I see here is, I feel like I've noticed a lot of people start to really focus on what does my calorie surplus need to be? And again, they shy away from trying to focus on building muscle because they think that they are going to have to gain all this weight to build muscle. We know that's not the case. And find that a lot of people, they have a lot of things they need to work on before there. And people that, one, they can build muscle without that calorie surplus. And then two, if they do get in that calorie surplus, there's a lot of things that they can focus on before they can really reap the rewards of that calorie surplus. And so again, too many people shy away from building muscle because they think they need to bulk or gain weight. And then they eat in a calorie surplus when it isn't a good time, or they won't benefit from it. So I'll dive into what that looks like. So people that would be good candidates to go into a surplus right away. One, and this is the most important thing, I think, that you could say that this probably takes precedent over everything else that I'm about to say, but we need to, and it revolves around training. We need to make sure how to push your training, okay? But we also need to make sure that training is specific to building muscle too. Those are two big things there with that. And I think the third thing on the training aspect is we need to make sure that you can train enough. And what I mean by that is somebody brought this question up to me. Hey, would you put somebody in surplus who, can only train 2 days a week? And I'm thinking that's just probably not enough. So we need to make sure that you can train enough overall. If you can only train 2 days a week, that's fine. You can still make gains, but you probably would be better off being closer to your energy balance versus being in a calorie surplus. But to go back to the training, what do I mean by just training needs to be there? You need to be able to push your training. I think a lot of people hear that and they just think, I just need to lift heavier. I just need to really push myself. I need to get my heart rate up. I just need to feel super beat up. And that's not necessarily the case, right? We want to make sure that training is specific to building muscle. So what are some of those things, right? We want to make sure that you have your execution dialed in. So that can be your technique. We want to make sure technique is, you don't have to overly focus on technique, but you want to make sure you have at least decent technique, right? Make sure your tempos are good. Make sure you're at least getting some of your range of motion in that long muscle lengths from time to time, right? Not overlooking that. So what I mean by that is in a bicep curl, just make sure that you don't always neglect that bottom portion of it, right? At least spend some time in there. Making sure that you take the target muscle fairly close to failure often, right? You don't have to go to failure every single time, but make sure that your muscle is the limiting factor there with that, right? So again, in a bicep curl, when you do it, is your bicep the thing that's failing, or is it your shoulders or something else? If it's your shoulders or elbow or other joints, you probably need to focus on your execution of that and get closer to failure there with that. And then when that makes it specific to building muscle, right? Whereas a lot of times people are like, okay, so I can do sets of 2 to 3 in the back squat and gain muscle. And that will help you build muscle, but it's probably not, we could probably get more specific. You could probably be better with the rep ranges that you choose, whatnot there with that. So that's kind of what I mean by we need to make sure we can push our training. We know how to execute it. We're using progressive overload, and we need to make sure that it's specific to building muscle, right? Sometimes just lifting weights isn't, it's a good starting point, but you do need to get that dialed in a little bit more there. And obviously, like I said, training enough. So to me, that's priority number one. A lot of times I see people that, again, are overly focused on a calorie surplus. They're like, hey, I've been training for 5 years. I weight train regularly, but then again, they don't do these things. And you're really missing out on, you're not going to reap the full rewards of the calorie surplus if this isn't there, right? And so a lot of people that come to me, I can tell them, hey, you can still body recomp. And I find that a lot of people they need to get that training aspect dialed in, and they need to make it more specific to building muscle. And those are some common things I see there. You could also put exercise selection in there as a mistake, whether that be just not choosing the best exercises. Maybe you have exercises that are overlapping, or maybe you just are like, you think you have to do a specific exercise there. And again, we know that for building muscle, you can be very flexible with your programming. You do want to make sure it does check some boxes off from there. And the biggest thing with this too, and this actually goes back to Eric Helm's study, and you said you interviewed him, so he may have brought this up, but one interesting finding is they found that, again, the higher surpluses usually led to more skin fold thickness increases, which was like, they attribute that to fat gain. However, in the biceps specifically, they found that the biceps did have a little bit more growth with a little bit more of a calorie surplus, from my understanding with that. And the biceps had more volume, which kind of lends to the fact that, hey, if you can do more volume, you can really push your training and whatnot, that's going to be helpful with the calorie surplus. So that was the big takeaway from there, and something that really just fine-tuned this for me. Spent a lot of time on that one because I just think that is the most important thing, right?
Yes.
Is the training aspect. So yes.
Because let's take these one by one so we can also discuss. So training is the number one priority in my view as well, because training drives muscle growth. It's not nutrition. The surplus can help, as we've discussed so far, but it's training that drives it. And when it comes to that specific study that you mentioned, that study and talking about it with Eric helped me articulate my thoughts on a surplus, and particularly in relation to training frequency, which is that I assign a surplus or a nutritional target in terms of calories based on the training stimulus provided. So when the training stimulus is too low, then the best way to build muscle and minimize fat gain is maintenance. As you mentioned, when somebody is training twice per week, the training stimulus is too low for the surplus to be beneficial, because you don't need that much extra energy to reap the benefits of training twice per week. Now, one question I have for you on this is, you said twice per week, too low. What's the minimum number of training sessions that you would want a client to do to allocate a moderate surplus to them?
Yeah. So I think on that number two, I would be careful with saying for sure, oh, hey, here's the cutoff, right? If somebody can only train 2 days a week, but they really want to maximize muscle growth, they can really push them, they can get a good amount of volume in those 2 days. They're relatively lean, which I don't want to go too in depth because these are going to be some of these things that we'll talk about. I think they could potentially get into surplus, right? So I don't want it to think of as this set in stone, hey, it has to be this. Because generally what I'm thinking, and this is my thought process on it and why I get here with 2 days is probably low, is just because if you can only train 2 days a week, that tells me that there's a lot of other things going on in your life. And that's more so the limiting factor than the 2 days of training, essentially.
Yes.
For example, what would be times when you can only train 2 days a week? Maybe you have a new kid, maybe you got school going on, or you're super busy with work. That's probably not the best time to throw in a calorie surplus. So I would say You could, again, depending on the person, I think 3 days there with that. I would be more comfortable with 4 days, but I think you could get away with 3. But for me to be the most comfortable, I think 4 days of training would be that number there. Again, 3 days would be just very dependent on the client and their individual situation and what's going on outside of the gym. Because I'm sure you have this too, where I have a lot of clients that they train 3 days a week and their family, but they have a family, maybe their job's somewhat demanding. They have their lifestyle, the lifestyle stuff in place. I would be more likely to potentially throw that person into a calorie surplus at that point. So hopefully that kind of answered your question there on that.
It does. My thoughts on when somebody's training twice per week. For one, it's the first thing. Actually, I have 2 thoughts. I'm trying to think of the best order to express it. I'll start with this one. So not only can one be in a position or a season of life where the demands from outside of training are too much for a calorie surplus, but also if somebody's training twice per week, often they are also the kind of person that still needs to dial in their training, their specificity, their intensity, execution, everything that you've mentioned. So that's why I tend to think that the stimulus is too low. It's not just the frequency of the training, but it's the quality of the training. Typically it's not the kind of person who's maximizing every single session. But the second thought I had is that I'm glad you brought up the demands outside of training, because since it's more food, I think there's a common misconception that a calorie surplus is easy to stay on top of, whereas a calorie surplus pushes the body out of homeostasis like a calorie deficit. So it does take a toll on the body. For example, you may feel overtly full at times in a way that may feel uncomfortable to you. Digestion may be impacted. You may feel like you're on a schedule with your meals, because if you miss one, now you have 1,000 calories left over at night and you can't sleep at night. So there are aspects to a surplus that make it similarly challenging to a deficit. So I'm glad that you mentioned the importance of being in a certain position in life to tackle a surplus, because I don't believe that it's something to overlook to get the best results out of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those are great points. The digestion is a huge one. That is definitely a point here that I wanted to make on that. Yeah, that's another big one there with it.
Awesome. So I have all the thoughts that I wanted to express on training. So you can move on to your next priority.
Awesome. Yeah. Real quick, one last thing on training. You hit on this too. I think if there's one big thing to take away from this, it's that, again, if you just think you're going to eat your way to gaining muscle, you're not. So you hit on that. And I think that's super important to say, right? And that's, again, why we're talking about the importance of training. Again, the surplus is only helpful if your training's there, right? If you're just in a surplus and you're not training, that's going to lead to more fat gain than you would like in that process.
Actually, that brought up a thought on my end as well. So you said that you can't eat your way to muscle growth. I wanted to say that you also can't overtrain your way to muscle growth, because when we talk about a certain frequency, I wouldn't want anyone to think, oh, then the more I train, the better. It's all very individual. I am reluctant to say that everybody must train at least 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, because the more you train, the more volume you're going to do per body part across a week of training, and more volume to a point builds more muscle. But what is more for you is different for every person. So what I'm trying to say is that everybody has a certain volume requirement. For some people, the best volume is very low. For some people, it's really high. So I wouldn't want anybody to think, oh, then if I'm training 6 days per week, then that is the best position to be in a surplus. Not necessarily if you're not able to recover and make progress from those 6 days. In my view, the best volume for you is a volume that's realistic. So you can actually get in the gym those many times per week. It's a volume that you're making progress on, so you're seeing progressive overload. It's a volume that makes you feel good in that, yes, of course, training is demanding. Training close to failure is going to tire you out, to fatigue you. However, you shouldn't feel like you can't carry on with the rest of your life because after training, you're KO'd and you need a nap every day.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And I also think the last thing I would add to that would just be your personal, what you enjoy, right? Some people enjoy lower volume, really pushing it. And then some people really enjoy higher volume and not pushing it as much. And I think, as you said, that quality is you're going to find out what that where that quality is at, where that volume's at, right? Because again, like you said, if you're not feeling good in the process because you're doing super high volume, you're also trying to go to failure all the time, you'll start to notice that, right? So I think there is a sense of that. And all these kind of variables they impact each other, right? Like you said, finding that is super important. Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because finding more is not always better. I heard this kind of analogy where it's like with muscle growth, people think, again, this goes to force feeding or just trying to eat more. And like you said, just trying to train more. It's like you're driving your car and you're slamming down on the gas. And it's like, you're just trying to make it go faster, but you already maxed it out. You can't get it to go any faster there with that. And that's an analogy that really helped me with that. And again, to go back to my initial story here, I thought I could do that. I thought I could just train more. I thought I could just eat more and I would build muscle faster. But unfortunately, it takes time there with that. Yeah, I'll go on to the next one. So I think the next one that's super important is going to be your sleep, right? So again, this kind of goes back to recovery, but I think sleep is another thing where kind of like we said earlier, if you're training 2 days a week because maybe you just have a new child and you can only sleep a couple hours a night, it's super interrupted. That's probably not the best time to throw in a calorie surplus, right? Because chances are that's just going to lead to more fat gain than you would like. Right. So we want to make sure sleep's on point. Now, this doesn't mean you need to sleep 10 plus hours a night and whatnot there, right? We just want to make sure that we're not completely screwing up sleep. I think anywhere from 6 to 8 hours is solid. And then within that, making sure your sleep hygiene is on point, right? Maximizing that quality of sleep as best as you can there with that. So that would be another big one. And the biggest reason with that too is there was a study where in a calorie deficit, they had 2 groups. I think one was sleeping 5 hours, one was sleeping like 8 hours. And again, remember, this is in calorie deficit. They both lost weight. However, the group that slept 5 hours lost more weight from lean body mass than the group that slept 8 hours, right? So just kind of the importance there of sleep. Making sure that you are sleeping well is going to be super important. And then that goes back to the point you said where the recovery aspect of it, that's also going to make sure that you train well. It's going to allow you to recover from training. So I think directly it will impact it, but I also think indirectly from being able to push your training and recover from training too, right? Because it's going to give you more quality training sessions on there from that standpoint. Number 2 on the list would be sleep there with that.
Excellent. And dear listeners, if you like to read, I actually wrote a comprehensive guide to sleep for muscle growth and fat loss, which I'm going to link in the show notes below, only because, Jeff, the study that you mentioned was cited in my article as well. I think it's a seminal study in the area that really showcases how important sleep can be. Now, onto your point, I basically hammer the importance of sleep into every client who's going to listen. Having said that, I'm glad that you played your own devil's advocate and you said you don't need to have perfect sleep because realistically, none of us has perfect sleep. You mentioned 6 to 8 hours is what you believe to be beneficial. I also think from a biofeedback perspective, dear listener, if you wake up and you feel refreshed, not in the first half hour to an hour of waking necessarily, because it takes a while to activate the computer for the system to come on, so to speak. So you might feel groggy for this amount of time when you first get up. But after that, if you feel consistently refreshed, then you know that regardless of how long you slept, your sleep was restorative and it essentially did the job. So if that's how you feel, your sleep is probably in a good place. What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Go off of how you feel. Like you said, if you're just like throughout the day, just feeling super sluggish, and then you're also like your brain just foggy, chances are you probably didn't get great sleep. And then from there, obviously that article you talked about, I'm sure you go into, hey, here's some ways to improve your sleep quality. But again, I think a big mistake people make with sleep is they always just think it's more time in bed, which I do think can help, but I'm a big fan of making sure that sleep quality is there. I think too many people overlook that sleep quality aspect of it. So making sure our sleep hygiene is in check there with that. And then also just making sure too, like what is your kind of like mindset around sleep? Because a lot of people, they don't get good sleep for a long period of time. And now they associate like their bed and nighttime ritual with poor sleep, anxiety. And so that's another big thing too, right? And I think that comes back to this, oh, hey, you need to sleep 8 to 10 hours a night. You need to get as much sleep as possible. And that kind of puts a lot of pressure on it. So I'm a fan of making sure that things that we do throughout the day and leading up to bed are in check versus more so you need to be in bed by 8 o'clock at night or something like that.
I agree. I think, as you said, pre-bed routine is really fundamental, but also what you do across the entire day is important in that I have clients who don't get enough sleep because they protect the small amount of free time that they have. So they don't have time in the day because they're so busy with work, family, and other life demands to for themselves, really, for their me time. So what they do is they backlog this me time to the end of the day, and then they stay up until late because they didn't have time for themselves up until then. That's why not only is a pre-bed routine, in my opinion, really important, so sleep hygiene, as you called it, but also making sure that you are managing to the best of your abilities, your stressors and your life demands and responsibilities, so that there is some time for you, so that you don't have to have this scarcity mindset where you're going to bed super late because you're trying to save those breadcrumbs of time that you have for yourself, which is easier said than done. I fell victim to this myself because being self-employed and loving what I do tend to work a lot. So I'm not speaking from a high horse. I'm not on top of a mountain in Vietnam or anything. However, I do acknowledge that when I manage to give myself that me time during the day, then I go to bed at night and my sleep is so much more restorative. And I've seen that with my clients as well. Once we start actually building a solid routine that includes de-stressing, relaxing time, as well as sleep hygiene routine, their sleep improves, their mood improves, their well-being becomes so much more enhanced.
Yeah, it has such an indirect effect on so many things. So yeah, I think it's super important. And like you said, it's easier said than done. I just always tell people like, okay, obviously if you're going to bed at 3, waking up at 6, obviously there you need to work on your sleep quantity and get a little bit more sleep. But you just want to make sure you don't completely screw it up. Like you said, hey, now you're staying up till 3 a.m. watching Netflix or something like that. Again, that we just don't want to completely screw it up there with that. Good for the next one?
Yeah, me too.
Cool. All right. So again, so far we've gone over training needs to be there. Sleep needs to be on point. If either of those are off, you can probably work on those things first, stay at maintenance and or potentially a small deficit depending on where you're at. And you likely will see some improvement in building muscle before you need to go into a surplus. So the next one here is diet quality, nutrition quality, solid nutrition, right? Again, what I mean by this is like making sure that one, your macros are in balance. So again, you don't have to be within like a gram. There's not this perfect macro setup. We just want to make sure that you have a good balance, right? We want to make sure that protein isn't super low. I'm a little bit more lenient with protein than I used to be, but I still think that you want to make sure that you're not completely screwing up protein, right? I think 7.8 grams per pound of body weight. Sorry, I'm using the US metric system here on that. I think that's 1.6 to 2.2 kilograms. I think if you're around there, you've maxed out protein, right? Again, you don't need to necessarily do more. Again, carbohydrates and fats, we just want to make sure we're not completely screwing those up. You don't want carbs to be super low. I don't think that's going to be great. So if you've always been somebody that's gone low carb, maybe increasing your carbs a little bit more can be helpful there, right? Fats, again, we just don't want them to be super low. So having or super high, because then that obviously will take away from carbs and potentially protein, right? So they all kind of interplay. So I think making sure you're eating the right amount of calories is super key, but within that, making sure you have a good balance of macros. But then take it a step further, what are those macros? What is that food made up of, right? If it's mostly just like tasty, super processed, kind of snacky type foods, you can obviously make an improvement there, right? We want to make sure that we're also fueling ourselves with good vitamins and minerals, some nutrient density. Again, you don't have to just eat quote unquote clean all the time, but we want to make sure that we're providing our body with those vitamins and minerals that are important to really make your body be in this optimal state from that standpoint for performance, for building muscle. There with that. Making sure you have good quality nutrition is super important, right? Because a lot of times I see that people really have a lot of wiggle room there with that, whether they don't eat enough carbohydrates, maybe they eat too much fats, maybe they eat just their processed food to quote unquote whole foods there's a lot of wiggle room here with that people have before they need to worry about being in a surplus there with that. So that's kind of my next big one there is solid nutrition, quality nutrition, but making sure that overall diet quality is good, right? Again, you don't have to be 100% whole food, clean diet food all the time, but again, making sure we have a good base during this period of time.
Jeff, that's music to my ears. In fact, funnily enough, I just posted a story on Instagram where I was sharing a check-in I had with a client where I gave her the homework of basically creating a food log based on my suggestions. And then I reviewed said food log. Oh, apologies. I don't know if you could hear that, but I got a call, stupid marketing call. I don't know if they happen in the US as well.
All the time.
It's awful. Anyway, moving on, dear listeners. I posted this story sharing how she then told me, hey, I created my food log. Have a look. Tell me what you think. And when I commented on her food log, I didn't just stop at, oh, your macros look good. I then moved on to assessing her food choices because I feel that if it fits your macros, that movement whereby as long as it's within your calorie range and your macro range, then you can eat whatever you want was really liberating for some people who used to believe that you must eat only whole foods or else. At the same time, it can also lead to the opposite issue where now you're filling up those calories and those macros with a lot of ultra processed foods that are not the best for your well-being if they make up the majority of your diet. So I'm really happy that you're mentioning not only the importance of calories and macros, but also the importance of what the food on your plate actually looks like.
Yeah, no, it's super important. Like you said, initially it was, hey, you just have to eat super clean all the time. And you could see where if you go too far in that spectrum where it's like, hey, I'm just using this because it's like the basic food that people always talk about, like chicken, broccoli, and rice. If you feel like you need to have that for every meal, it becomes really challenging to get in enough energy that you need for, you end up risking not being able to eat enough food. Right. For example, I have had somebody who on Instagram, they've reached out, we've gone back and forth, and she's always struggled with, she knows she needs to build more muscle, but she's always been in that fat loss mindset. And she was telling me that she really likes to eat high protein, really high fiber, which again, you come into the fitness community, you're like, oh, that's what I need to do all the time. But it can become very challenging to, now she's probably missing out on the carbohydrates she needs. So you could see where if you fall too far on that side where you just try to eat clean foods all the time, it's going to be really hard from a digestion standpoint. It's going to be really hard to get in enough food that you need. And you end up kind of being in this, you break that first kind of goal there that we wanted, and that's getting out of a deficit. So you can take it too far, but then like we talked about on the other end of the spectrum where now it's okay, IIFYM, if it fits your macros comes into play. Now people take that too far and they're like just eating Pop-Tarts and Taco Bell and stuff like that all the time, right? It's okay. We need to find this happy medium here. But making sure you give your body the micronutrients it needs can really go a long way there. Yeah, again, super important there with that.
Agreed. What's your next priority?
Yeah. So the next one is, and you hit on this earlier, is good gut health, good digestion, right? But I think this also goes hand in hand with your diet quality, overall like diet pattern, and then also sleep can impact this. So what I mean by this is if, you're somebody that you're having a lot of gut health issues. And what I mean by that is maybe you're like super, like you get super bloated, or maybe like you get super constipated for extended periods of time. You need to focus on that first before going into a calorie surplus, right? So let's take the example of if you're always constipated. If that's the case and you just keep shuttling all this food into your system, it's like now you're going to continue to get back up, right? And that's not going to be great from a muscle building standpoint, right? You're likely not absorbing all those nutrients. So that can become an issue. So we want to make sure gut health is in a good spot. And what are some kind of things there that I focus on with that? Some kind of low-hanging fruit is one, sleep's going to be super important. Stress management overall, making sure you're managing your stress, not to say you can't have any stress, but we want to manage it. Making sure like when we're eating, we're slowing down when eating, we're eating undistracted, we're eating in a not super stressed state, right? Because it's going to be probably harder for your body to absorb all the nutrients that you're giving it. Alcohol is something that can really impact your gut health. And then any foods that you find that bother, right? So for some clients, certain foods do just bother them and they don't digest them well. So figuring out what that is there with that. And again, like we just talked about, having a good kind of balance of overall diet quality can be super helpful there with that. Making sure that's in a good spot, I think, is super important in this process.
One thing that I also focus on is the diversity of the diet. So having a variety of fruit and vegetables and different protein sources, different carb sources, different dietary fat, because we don't know a lot about gut health, but what we do seem to know is that your microbiome seems to benefit from a diverse diet. So we can't say exactly which type of diet is the best for each person because each person's microbiome is different. But it seems that the diversity really helps to feed all the different species of bacteria and other life forms that live inside us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you summarized that very well. And again, I think these are big things I see here that are low-hanging fruit for people is the slowing down when eating, right? If you are maybe you're somebody who's tried this calorie surplus in the past and that's a lot of food for you, and like you just try to really eat a lot of food in a short amount of time, so you may want to look at that. Another big thing I see there is like really high protein levels. Sometimes that can mess with it. But I think the big thing is that what's going on when you're eating your food, making sure that's in a good spot. You're in this like kind of nice, relaxed state. You're slowing down, chewing your food up can be super helpful there with that. So
absolutely. What is your next one?
So the next one is going to be your body fat levels. Okay. So somebody who is on the leaner side, well, we're talking on the leaner side. What is that? I would say for men, probably sub 8 to 10% body fat. For women, we're looking at about 15 to 17% there on that, right? And the reason being is if you're leaner like that, you being at maintenance or in a deficit is not going to put you in a great position to build muscle, right? So you're likely somebody who's going to respond well to a calorie surplus. Now, again, we need to make sure that these other things are on point beforehand, everything that we talked about before here, but you're going to be somebody that's going to be a little bit more receptive to a calorie surplus at that point. Your body fat levels are going to be key, right? So if you take somebody who's 15 to 20% body fat for men, or again, maybe 25 to 30% or higher for women, that's where you're likely going to be better off being a little bit closer to maintenance, or potentially you have a little bit more room to recomp, especially if these things that we already talked about are off. So I think body fat levels are a big thing, right? The common thing here that I see is somebody's between that 15 to 20% body fat levels, and they're like, should I bulk or should I cut? And it's, you have some wiggle room here to, again, you could, depending on if you've been in a deficit for an extended period of time, you likely would be better to go closer to your maintenance. If you're somebody who has maybe been in a surplus because you haven't really been tracking, or maybe closer to maintenance, you might be able to be in a smaller, very small calorie deficit here and seek some recomp, especially if these things that we already talked about are off. So body fat levels are going to be a big thing there as well.
The way I look at body fat levels is circling back to what you said at the beginning from a health first perspective, which you said that you like to take. If somebody has obesity or if they are overweight, then adding more body fat, even if you build muscle in the process, is going to have a cost for your health. So that's why I would be reluctant to assign a calorie surplus to somebody until they had at least what would be considered standard body fat levels for their size. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, when somebody is actually classified as underweight, that's when I would want them to put on not only necessarily muscle, but also that's one case in which putting on body fat is potentially beneficial, because if your body weight is relative to your size is classified as underweight, then adding muscle is going to be obviously beneficial, like it is for everyone, but also adding a little bit of extra body fat is going to be helpful for your well-being, because there's a range of body fat percentages within which your body feels it's best and it's thriving. And if you are underweight, you are likely below that range. And I've talked about this range before. It's based on the Speaksman's model. So I'm not going to belabor the point, dear listeners. You already know this if you've been listening to me for a while. I rant about this all the time. But anyway, that is what I would be looking at in terms of the extremes of body fat levels. Now, if you're square in the middle, so you're not overweight, you don't have obesity, you're not underweight, then you have the freedom to choose. Do you want to take it slowly and stay around maintenance? Or do you want to really push your muscle growth as fast as is realistic while minimizing fat gain? Then you can go into a surplus.
Yeah, no, I think you summed that up perfectly, right? If you're in between, you have that option there if you want. So really it comes down to what are you comfortable with there with that? And then I'll also think about it this way as you hit on like the obesity side of things. If you are overweight, we talked about one of the benefits of a calorie surplus is that it puts your body in that optimal position, right? It's one of the reasons why we want to have more energy coming in is because muscle is lower on the priority list, right? And so if you have a lot of body fat, you have that surplus on your body, right? That extra energy is just sitting there, right? That's where why somebody that's in that position, they don't need to be like, oh, hey, I need to go into a surplus there with that. And that kind of leads into the next one there and you hit on this, like if you're in that in between where you have the option, I would say the next person that would be a candidate to go into a surplus is somebody who isn't overly concerned about gaining a little bit of body fat. They don't care if they're not like super lean there with that. Again, if you are somebody that's in between and you're like, you know what, I want to build a little bit extra muscle. I'm okay if I gain a little bit of body fat in the process. I'm not worried about being super lean. You are somebody that would be a better candidate to go into a calorie surplus versus someone who's they maybe are really scared of doing that. They have a little bit of body fat on them already. We're most likely going to put you at maintenance or a small calorie deficit there with that. So again, if you're somebody who doesn't care about a little bit of fat gain, you would be somebody that's more of a candidate to go into a surplus right away.
Yeah, mindset is really important because you're going to self-sabotage. If you're scared of gaining a little bit of body fat, then you're focusing on the wrong priority, in my view, in that if you're going into a surplus, the priority is to build muscle. So if you're looking at it only through the lens of oh, I'm going to add body fat as well, then you're not prioritizing really muscle growth. You're not excited about it. You're going to self-sabotage. And that was the case for me for when I started. And I went through a fat loss phase. And after that, I was like, now I'm going to commit to a building phase in a surplus. And my surplus was I gained a pound. I got scared. I was like, gaining too fast. Better lower my calories now. My calories, then my weight went back to where baseline. So I increased my calories again, gained a pound in 2 weeks. No, too fast. And that went on for months. And then in the end, I had to acknowledge with myself, dude, you're not building anything like that. Or rather, I was building muscle, but I wasn't in a surplus. So I was like, if your goal is a surplus, be in a surplus, man, because right now we're not doing that. So yes, mindset is really important. Interestingly, I found with my clients that going through a fat loss phase beforehand, if it is the right decision for you and your body composition at the time, can actually be beneficial because more than one client went through a fat loss phase successfully with me, maybe for the first time, because many people try and unfortunately do not succeed at losing body fat. And then they told me, with you, I learned that I'm capable of losing body fat. So now I'm excited about a surplus because I know that if I gain a little bit, I can lose it again because I've done it before. So interestingly, potentially a fat loss phase could help gain the skill and the confidence to go into a surplus afterwards, provided again that it is right for you at this stage in your body composition experience.
No, that's a great point. Yeah. Like you said, because then they have that, like you said, that confidence that they can do it again. On this too, I mean, I had a thought. It's going to come back to me. Don't worry. Okay. So this is what it was. I think it's really important for somebody who is worried about seeing any weight gain. I always like to bring this up. There's two different scenarios. You have the person who is uncontrollably gaining weight because they're not tracking anything. They're not weight training. They're not focused on their nutrition. They're not focused on sleep. Their diet quality is crap. And yeah, in that scenario, you are likely weight gain going to be a lot of fat mass versus if you're somebody who you work out regularly, you weight train, you're doing these other things that we're talking about. It's slow and controlled. It's like you're going to be gaining mostly lean body mass in that process. So I think it's really important to like how you go about what you do in the process of weight gain, weight loss. It's just so important, right? I think people just think of it too much of, weight gain automatically bad, weight loss automatically good. But what you do within that is super important. For anybody who has that mindset like yours, it can be super helpful to reframe it and think about it from that standpoint.
It's certainly ironic that the people who worry the most about gaining body fat are the people who need to worry about that thing.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And then my last one here, and this, before I say this is very dependent, okay? I know everybody has their goals. However, and I'll explain why I put this. I would say in general, who's the best candidate to go into a surplus right away? If we're going to look at genders, I would say men, okay? Biggest reason being is if we were to compare men versus women typically they need to have more body fat, right? But they're always going to have a little bit more body fat on their body. And as we talked about, that is very, body fat is energy dense, right? That's a storage form of energy, right? So women are always going to typically have a little bit more body fat in general, if you were to compare, which they need, right? So because of that, I would say men have a little bit more wiggle room to probably be in a calorie surplus to start, right? I think women can get away with recomping more than men can. And also to back this up even a level further, I had a Martin McDonald on my podcast and he talked about why he doesn't think women should bulk. And one of the reasons is when in a calorie surplus, men tend to upregulate their NEAT a little bit more versus women tend to not do that as much, right? On average. So it's not for everybody. So if I were to compare 1-to-1, I would say men are going to be more likely to be in a calorie surplus than women. However, in saying that, everybody has their goals and you should do what you want to do. So long as these things that we talked about are on point, just understand that you are likely able to get away with less of a calorie surplus from that standpoint.
That's certainly an interesting perspective that I had not heard before, actually. And it brings to mind a podcast that I recorded with another guest who was talking about sex-based differences in training and whether there are any. And this was Dr. David Nolan in episode 73, dear listeners. And we talked about how people assign female at birth just for inclusivity of language. And if they identify as women, they are typically initiated to resistance training later in life than people assigned male at birth. Like, for example, I often talk to other guys who were assigned male at birth and they'll say, I started lifting when I was 12, just like you just told me. I was lifting my dad's weight. If I had done that, it would have been really odd because at the time growing up, I was I presented as a female. People thought that I was a woman. And for me to lift weights, that would have been really strange. I don't even know if they would have thought if it would have been allowed. I wasn't interested personally, but it wasn't something that you heard about very often in my community about girls taking up weightlifting. So thinking about that also makes me think that perhaps it's not so much sex-based, but it's a difference in training experience, in that if you were assigned male at birth, you're already more advanced, so you're likely able to reap the benefits of a surplus. Whereas if you are assigned female at birth, perhaps you started training a bit later in life, so you still have a greater capacity to build muscle and lose fat at the same time, or recomping, even if you are at maintenance rather than in a surplus. So potentially it's not necessarily only a sex-based difference, but it's more a societal difference.
And then also body fat levels. And then hormonal profiles, right? So we can take it from that standpoint, right? That would probably make a little bit more sense there with that. Your hormonal profile, your body fat levels, and then like you said, training history is going to play a big role in that. Yeah, no, I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah. So I want to be, before we continue, Jeff, I want to be respectful of your time. I can carry on for a while, but I want to know, are you okay with that as well? Cool. Okay, so we're good with this final point you just made. Do you have any other priorities that you would want to cover?
Those were the ones I had listed there.
Okay, so I would say my second to last question, which is related to this topic, is going to be, clearly we've established so far that many of these aspects, if not all of them, are person dependent. So I don't expect that you're going to give a specific amount of time in answer to this question. But in your experience coaching people since 2015, 2016, how long would you see a client who needs to work on any or all of these aspects to be doing this before they're ready for a surplus? Just to give the listeners an idea of how long might you want to spend in this muscle building, muscle gaining primer phase before you go into a surplus?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Like you said, I think initially, like you said initially, it is going to be very dependent on the person, right? So again, if you're somebody who maybe you've had a little bit of a break from training, but you've done this, you pick up on all these things very quickly, you're gonna be looking at a much shorter time frame versus somebody who doesn't have a long training history. Maybe you're a little less consistent with things. Obviously, things are going to be a little bit longer there. I would say on average, a good time frame would be try to commit to this for at least 3 to 6 months. I think this would be a good time frame to focus on this first and really get these things dialed in before feeling like you need to go into that surplus. To really commit to it for, like I said, I think 3 to 6 months is a good time frame, but understanding that, hey, it could be a little bit shorter than that. It could be longer too. I don't think there's anything wrong with, let's say, for example, you are somebody who maybe you are like, you don't want to gain a ton of body fat, things like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with spending upwards of a year or longer doing this, right? If you're continuing to work on your training, making sure that's in a good spot, you're continuing to dial in your nutrition, you're continuing to work on your sleep, you're like, to me, you're still, so long as you go back to that very first thing that I talked about, what is the main goals, get you out of a deficit. I think so long as you're doing that, you're making positive changes to your body there with that. So that would be my thing. I think 3 to 6 months on average, understanding it could be a little less, it could be a little bit more, but there's also nothing wrong with spending much longer than that as well too. So hopefully I gave you a good answer on that. I don't know if you have any follow-ups on that or anything.
The way I would look at that duration that you indicated, which I largely agree with, is from a number of perspectives. Perspective number one is that if you are earlier in your training experience in committing to this kind of lifestyle, likely you may end up spending a little bit on the longer side of this range in this primer phase. Whereas if you're already a little bit more experienced, likely you may be closer to the 3 months mark, if not less. Another perspective that I have is that if you commit to this phase, you can also give yourself the opportunity to discover if you enjoy the results, because you may also have been led to believe that a surplus is the best way to build muscle. And while that might be true from a time efficiency standpoint, the best is relative. So you might find that at the rate at which you're building muscle while staying in a muscle building primer phase, you're at maintenance or around maintenance, you're actually really happy. I have a client, shout out to M, who I know listens in sometimes, so told me just very recently, I'm very happy to stay at maintenance, I like to see how my body is changing. I like the rate at which it is changing. I don't need to make things any faster or more demanding for me because they're also a self-employed person. They work full time in a completely different industry. They don't have the bandwidth for more demands from a fitness standpoint. And that's an absolutely fair point. But also by committing to originally staying at maintenance before a surplus, they gave themselves the chance to find out, hey, actually, this rate of muscle growth looks amazing to me. I'm really happy here. Similarly, if you are more like me and you're reluctant to put on body fat and you self-sabotage when you're in a surplus, or you tend to, then by being at maintenance, you also give yourself the chance to find out that maybe quite frustrates you to be at maintenance and not be able to put on muscle faster, which is ultimately what happened to me. I was like, I'm not seeing change at the rate that I know I'm capable of, so I better put myself in a surplus to make that happen. And that's how my mindset flip-flopped to a point where now I struggle far less with building muscle in a surplus. So these are the perspectives that I would be looking at your range of 3 to 6 months from.
No, I think that's great. I think you summed that up good. And also maybe it's, again, a thing where we name it, right? Where it's maybe it's a primer. We should rename it to a primer to a calorie surplus, right? Because I think a lot of times people hear primer and then it's, oh crap, I'm not making progress. It's like, no, you are, like, you still, again, if we go back to our checklist of building phase, like you're still building your body up and everything like that. I would say, if anything, maybe it's like reframing it to a primer to like a calorie surplus, because in that specific example, your client clearly was improving their body composition. They were building muscle, even though they weren't technically in that surplus.
Absolutely. Yeah. I will die on this hill. You can build muscle surplus. I believe that it's the popularization of bodybuilding culture has led to this misconception whereby you must be in a surplus to really build muscle, when that's not quite the case. For example, athletes in different sports who have nothing to do with bodybuilding build muscle without really putting themselves through cycles of fat loss and muscle gain, because they are consistent with their training.
And then too, this is a whole separate topic, but like we talked about throughout too, you can, even in a small deficit, if you're somebody who is new to training, you have maybe higher than 15 to 20% body fat or more, you still need to dial in sleep. Your nutrition can get dialed in. Like, you have some runway there to also be in a surplus. Now, we want to be careful with that, because then you can go, the longer you do that, the more things get dialed in, the more muscle you build, the longer you're in that deficit, there's going to start to be some diminishing returns there with it. But again, you have some flexibility here with all this. So
yeah, that's absolutely true. Just like you said earlier, if you have obesity, you already carry the surplus energy as stored body fat. So you can absolutely put on muscle while you're in a deficit to lose the excess body fats, because your body has that extra stored energy.
Nothing pains me more than to see somebody who maybe is in that kind of category there. They're pretty high body fat levels and they're like, hey, should I be focused on building muscle or should I just lose weight? And it's, oh man, you can do both, right? You need to be doing both, right? Because then it gets to that either or, where now they're just trying to drop weight, and we know how all that goes. Definitely important to make sure you weight train here and whatnot, right? And so, as we've been trying to say throughout, we're trying to dispel this myth that you have to be in a calorie surplus to build muscle. So hopefully we did a good job of it. I think we did.
Fingers crossed. But on that note, what you just said saddens me, because I feel it disempowers people, because there are people who carry excess body fat who feel discouraged because they really want to build muscle, but they think that since it's not ideal for them to go into a surplus and put on more weight than they already carry, then by focusing on fat loss, they're not going to be able to do that. And I think that is a very defeating thought to have. That's why I hope that, dear listeners, this is now clear in your head and seared into your brain. You can absolutely build muscle in a deficit if you're in that kind of position. And you can also build muscle around maintenance if you have more standard, let's call them, body fat levels. Now, Jeff, you've done a fantastic job. I think that this is going to be really valuable. And I also stole an extra 15 minutes of your time, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, no,
now,
it's fun.
To end the podcast, I want to ask you where people can connect with you so that I can add all these links in the show notes.
Yeah. Real quick, can I do a quick summary, some takeaways?
Yeah, I should have asked you. Is there anything that you want to add to put a bow on the episode?
Yeah, no, first of all, I I love spending time talking about this, so I appreciate it. And I'm glad we were able to connect. And even if it was a little bit longer, I think a lot of useful information here. So I do just want to go over a few quick takeaways, and then I'll go over where people can find me and everything. Again, my takeaways are most clients have a lot of things to work on before needing a calorie surplus to build muscle, which we talked about throughout. Therefore, can build muscle at maintenance, or like we talked about in some cases, at a small deficit. By focusing on these things first, which the things we talked about, a client will see a good recomp in this process, right? Again, without having to be in that surplus, you'll see that recomp. You'll add some muscle, maybe drop some body fat as well, depending on what's going on there. If these are dialed in for an extended period of time and you want to continue to add more muscle, then a surplus may be a good choice for you. But in some cases, you may not ever need to be in a calorie surplus, depending on goals, right? If you're not trying to be the most muscular person, you might not need to even ever be in that calorie surplus if you don't want to. However, if you decide to go into a calorie surplus, just make sure you have these other variables in place, as they are just as important as the actual surplus is itself, right? Again, there's no magic to the surplus unless you have these other variables in place to supplement that surplus. So just wanted to get that point across. Appreciate your time and asking me these questions. They were awesome. You're a great host. Did you have any follow-ups to that real quick before I go on to the last part?
No, I think that was an excellent summary. And if we just get into the habit of summarizing each other's thoughts, we can go on forever. Because I also love to talk about this stuff, so I could go on all night.
Cool. That's where people can find me. Again, my podcast, the Mind Muscle Connection podcast on Apple, Spotify, post on there 3 times a week. So check that out. And then Instagram, Jeff, Hoehn _. And that's where I'm most active. I post pretty much every day. I do Q&As and everything like that on there. So those would be the best places to find me. I'm on YouTube, but same thing there. That's where I just post my podcasts there with that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All of the links will be in the show notes, as always, dear listeners. Now, Jeff, thank you again. Listeners, thank you for lending me some of your time. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be in your ears, whoever is listening today, or in the future as well. And until next time.